Greetings, brethren, and welcome to this important presentation today where we will address one of the longest standing controversies amongst Davidians since the death of Brother Houteff. That is the question about storehouse versus headquarters and what should we have today and where's the storehouse gone and so forth. So we'll be addressing that today, not so much from a text point, but from a visual perspective. We're going to show an animation so that you can see clearly how God has led his people through this period from 1955 up to the present. So we're going to show you a simple way to illustrate the storehouse versus headquarters issue, long-standing controversy, and address the question, how have these entities evolved since 1955? We're going to do it visually so you can clearly see what's going on. And then is there a key to unravel the confusion? Because people have been perplexed by this, because all these groups and factions claiming we're the original. But the question is, well, what is a key to identify the original or the real one versus counterfeits? They can't all be in agreement, and nobody sees eye to eye. Doctrines are different, publications are different. So something has to give us an identifier to recognize the original. So we're going to see how that works. Part of this was prompted by this graphic that was shared in a presentation, and I immediately recognized there's problems with this, and I've shared it to people, and I said, what are the problems with this? What it is an attempt to diagram the various Davidian offshoots or splinters since the dissolving of Old Mount Carmel after Brother Houteff died. So you've got the branch and their factions. You have Florence Houteff usurping takeover, and then groups that broke from her that reorganized. And so you've got Bashan people, and you've got Salem and Mount Dale and Waco. But the problem with this is it's not correct. It's got blatant errors. Well, the other thing is, where's it come from? Well, the source is it comes from a unauthorized symbolic code, volume 2021, numbers 4, 5, and 6. And this comes from a website that is owned and run by Linux Sam. So this is a Linux Sam produced graphic. And what it does is basically used to exalt or lift his Davidian 11th hour church movement, and claiming that they're an upshoot from Waco that split from Mount Dale in 1991. The problem with this is it's not only exalting this counterfeit association, but it also is historically inaccurate. In particular, the role of Ukaipa. They push it over to the side there on the right. But nobody understands how Ukaipa was used by God to preserve the original literature. And so we're on examining this, it's blatantly false. It's full of inaccuracies. So we got to set the record straight and show the true lineage of who God used to preserve the original shepherd's rod message, and then the origin of these various splinters or offshoots. So that's what prompted this. Is I saw somebody using this, and I said, this is no good. We got to have something that is more accurate. So that's what I'll diagram for you today. Now, to set a backdrop, we've used this before in previous publications, documenting the rise and fall of Old Mount Carmel's Center from 1930 up until 1962. And as we go through this from left to right, we're going to introduce some graphics to illustrate how things evolved or developed under the tenure of Brother Houteff. So this is an important backdrop. We have videos on this in the past, and you could check a link in the description box below for some of those key videos that talk about the rise of Old Mount Carmel Center. So starting in 1930, we have the origin of UPA, which is Universal Publishers Association, Los Angeles, California. And I'm going to identify it with this green arrow. The green is the publishing work of UPA. Next, in 1931, the Storehouse moved, because that's the first record of tithe being returned, accepted by this new publishing association. And that, by definition, is God moving the storehouse from the General Conference to now this new fledgling movement of the Shepherd's Rod. 1935, Brother Houteff relocated the storehouse / headquarters to Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas, for strategic reasons, and that's all recorded in the history. And this began what we call the period of the headquarters. That's when we first see that term being used in the old codes. And that existed up until Brother Houteff died. So this is the period where you might call it Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas, 1935 to 1955. 1937, there is a record in some of the broad publications of the Shepherd's Rod Seventh-day Adventist bylaws. We've been unable to locate a copy of those bylaws, but it is recorded that they existed. But still, at this time, there is no higher order organization. That did not come until 1943 with the publication of the Davidius, and that's where you see the term GADSDA first coined, and what that stands for is General Association Davidian Seventh-day Adventist. And there was a reason for that, was because the church was failing to support the conscription status or non-combatant status of Davidian ministers or young men. So Brother Houteff was forced, in order to redress the government on this issue, to organize a legal entity that could support these Davidian young ministers, and so he called it General Association Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. And so we likened this period to the GADSDA period that existed started in 1943 up until Brother Houteff died. Now, the important point to note here is, and we show that in the arrow, we got the UPA that still existed, but we surround it with the blue arrow to show us now this higher order of organizational structure. And at that time, you see the Executive Council established, with the president being Brother Houteff. He chose the other members of the council, his cabinet, if you will, the vice president, secretary, treasurer, and so forth. And this is all recorded in Fundamental Beliefs, who are the members of that. That higher order structure included not only UPA, but it included a school for the children, a rest home for the old people, agricultural enterprises, an infirmary to take care of sick people, a school for the children, the DLI program, ministerial training program. So that was quite a comprehensive development or progression. 1954, that was the completion of the original Shepherd's Rod message with the publication of Symbolic Code Volume 10, Number 2. And at that point, the rod was complete. Everything. Anything that arises after this date is unauthorized counterfeit, specifically the new codes, as many Davidians are aware of. And then, of course, Brother Houteff dies in 1955. What happened to the GADSDA? Well, it ceased to exist. And it began the period of the sell-off of Old Mount Carmel. And we know from recorded evidence that the day after Brother Houteff died, he died on February 5th. The next day, February 6th, Florence Houteff, by a cold calculated plot, conceived a meeting and reorganized the association, removed the office of president, and had herself installed and voted in by the rest of the council as vice president. So I show that with the green arrow. UPA was still there, but now the organizational structure was corrupted, symbolized by the red outline. And it went from bad to worse. Basically, the devil used her in an attempt to destroy the message. Everything from the literature to the organizational structure. And by 1962, that was all over. But 1961 was a critical year because 100% rod-only Davidians, as they called themselves, recognized her apostasy, rose up and opposed it, and made a call to reorganize. And this is a crucial event because they rescued the original rod message from this apostate woman and her renegade council, which by 1962, we show you with the black arrow, was dead. She renounced the message, and her council resigned, and they walked away with the tithe money. So does that mean the rod was dead? And the answer is absolutely not. God had these faithful Davidians, shown by the green arrow here, to restore or rescue the original message. And I show that by the green arrow projecting forward. So in our next graphic, we're going to show you in detail through animation the involvement of the storehouse in this period through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This has been a long-standing paradox amongst Davidians. Well, how do we know where the storehouse is today? Well, the answer is to go back and trace it through this period of history. So that's what we're going to do in this next graphic. Now, we have a color key code here, the green being the UPA, which published the original Shepherd's Rod tract literature. The blue outline was the original GADSJ under Brother Houteff, the legitimate one. And then, of course, after he died, Florence Hijack took over and corrupted it. And that's symbolized by the red outline, the red around the arrow. So now we want to break this down into the progression of original UPA publishing houses versus the various rod splinter groups that have arisen since 1955. And I want to do this step by step so you can see it. It's logical. So we start, of course, with the original GADSJ under Brother Houteff that existed up until his death in 1955. So we've got the original UPA with the original GADSJ. He dies 1955. Recorded fact, Florence hijacks the organization and corrupts the GADSJ. As I mentioned before, she removed the office of president, should have been given over to Brother E.T. Wilson, who was the vice president, but he was ill and out of the way, so she moved in quickly and installed herself, unauthorized. So it's the corrupted, defiled association leadership model, symbolized by the red outline. Then we get to the 61 reorganization. The rod-only Davidians opposed her, and their call, if you look in the symbolic code documenting this event, was to get away from the corrupted literatures that she was defiling and get back to publishing the original. That was mandate 1, and mandate 2 was to train Bible workers. And that mandate still exists today. But, unfortunately, they drug along with them this corrupted organizational structure. So they followed Florence and voted and nominated to have a vice president and the remainder of the executive council, following the example of Saul. And we've documented it in another video we talked about, and it did about a year ago, about hour-long video, the difference between storehouse and headquarters. And we share that statement, break it down in 8-track, page 48, how the church is choosing to follow the example of Saul by voting and nominating their officers. And that's exactly what Florence established, and Davidians have followed that more or less ever since. So we're going to identify it with that red, corrupted organizational structure. But the key here is they still preserved the original message, the green, the publishing of UPA. So yes, they were corrupted, but they kept their literature alive, and that's the key thing. That existed in California until 1970. They decided to relocate to Salem, South Carolina. That's where the Davidian rest home that was built in the 1940s and visited by Brother Houteff. So they were familiar with the place, and they relocated there, had a session, and once again kept alive the original literature. This is the key. This is the key to unlock it. Who kept alive the original rod publications, symbolized by the green here? So this is UPA moving to Salem in 1970. But they still kept that corrupted leadership model of Florence. So they voted in a vice president, some Smith, and so forth, and the rest of the officers. So they're still following Florence in that regard. But disagreements with Don Adair usurped and took over, and so in 74 there was a split. And this is where Lennox Sam and everybody else gets it wrong. The faithful Davidians, and this is recorded in a letter, 12 of them, opposed on a dare using an unauthorized symbolic code to introduce his various doctrines. And so there was opposition, and then they reorganized back in California in Yucaipa. And what did they do? They kept alive the original literature. This is a key date. And so everybody puts Yucaipa off to the side. Yucaipa is part of the lineage of who kept alive UPA. It's an absolute established historical fact. Then later, 1986, it moved to Mountaindale. Well, where did Mountaindale come from? Well, there was a group of Davidians in New York that were part of Salem, and we'll show that later is the Salem branch, that discovered these older Davidians at Yucaipa. And a remarkable thing, they joined together and had a joint session and merged in 1986. And Yucaipa had the publishing press, the printing press, and the plates, and they brought that, eventually got transferred to Mountaindale. So Mountaindale became the UPA, kept alive the original literature, starting in 86. However, by the year 2005, Mountaindale was no longer publishing original, and they weren't interested in seeing it published around the world. So out of necessity, UPA 7 had to move. And this is where we come up with the UPA 7, the seventh movement of UPA. And unlike the prior groups, we stripped the corrupted Florence out of leadership model. So notice, no red banner around it. So this UPA 7 worldwide is a movement to establish publishing houses around the world without the corrupted leadership model, voting and nominating and all the politics and theater that happen in these other associations. That's the big distinction. So the red corrupted GADSTA is gone. It's back to the foundation, the core that started in 1930, that existed up until for 13 years until they had the GADSTA. So we are not authorized to install a corrupted GADSTA, but we can, just like in the 61 mandate, publish original literature and train Bible workers. We can do that. The instructions are already in the rod. So this is the straight and narrow true lineage of the succession of the UPA that published and kept alive the original rod literature. That's really the straight line from how the Storehouse moved from 1955 up until the current day. So right now as we speak, there are publishing houses being set up in countries around the world. Now it begs the question, well, where did all these other splinters come from? Now we're going to break that down. And you can see where these people come from. The big one that broke immediately after Brother Houteff died was, of course, Ben Roden, who stepped up and usurped and claimed, Brother Houteff warned about these usurpers, claimed that, oh, he's Elijah would never die. So we got the Ben Roden and the bogus branch. Well, what happened in 1978? He dies. The wife, Lois, takes over and then introduces additional heretical doctrines such as the feminine Holy Spirit. Lois dies, and then there's a big rival between various factions, and you've got splinters off of this bogus branch. David Koresh, of course, being the most infamous. He dies, in 1993, and then Clive Doyle kind of was in a small group. We're still following Koresh. Clive Doyle's died recently, so I don't know if there's any branch off of that. But there were other branches that didn't go for Koresh, like, for example, Doug Mitchell. But then he dies, and his successor is now this long-haired David Koresh clone up in Canada, Trent Wildey. And then you've got other ones, Charles Pace, who occupies part of that branch property today. And then another one, Thomas Caldwell, who has a website. So that's some of the branch stuff and all of their factions. What about other Davidian groups? Well, this is a pattern you're going to see. Every time that God raises up a storehouse to preserve the original message, immediately the devil comes in and there's a split and creates a counterfeit. So these 100% rod-only Davidians that reorganized to oppose the apostasy of Florence in 61, the next year there's a split in 62. And the two leaders, Brother Harry Warden, who was original minister under Brother Houteff, he preserved the rod Message Association in California, in Vista, California in the 70s. But M.J. Bingham rose up making a claim, oh, Carmel's withered, we're now in the Bashan pasture. And so they had a split, and this is all documented in 62. So the question becomes, well, who's right and who's wrong? And the only way to address that is, what did they publish and what did they teach? So now you can look and examine, well, what were the fruits or the publications of the Vista group compared to Bashan and Bingham's organization? And you can clearly rule out Bashan. We color-coded them purple, representing, they think that they have the porter and the president and all of this. And all their publications, like I say, if you look at them, compared to the original, they're all corrupted. And then out of Bashan has sprung up various factions, the Gilead pasture under M.T. Jordan out of Canada, and then the Mustard Seed Ministry under Derek West. So these are splinters off of the Bashan line. We color-coded those purplish. When they moved to Salem in 1970, of course, the devil wasn't going to stand idly by, and in 74 there was a split where Don Adair basically did a coup d'etat, had people come in and nominate and vote him into vice president. He hijacked the symbolic code, began to introduce heretical doctrines, and this became what we call New Salem under Don Adair, and he maintained that position of authority, vice president, until his death this past year in 2023. So the question has always become, Don Adair and his resident council, which was his third wife, maintained control of that organization for all those years. So the question becomes, well, what happens after he dies? Well, he has passed away this year, and now there's a group of loyalists, they call themselves now Salem International, okay, that are trying to keep alive the Salem movement. They brought in a new vice president, Obi Chalala, a man from Zambia, to come into the U.S. and take over and run their place. So that's one splinter off. But there's another one that most people, I would submit, almost nobody knows about, is this new GADSDA. We call it GASDA 2200. That's a code word for the address, 2200 Mount Carmel Drive, Waco, Texas. This is just down the street from 2500 Mount Carmel Drive, which is the Waco group that broke from Mountaindale in 1991. We'll get to that in a minute. But who's all behind this? Now, it's a man named Samuel Gonzalez. Most people have never heard of this guy. He's got these websites up, shell websites, and he's been promoting on Facebook a couple of years ago all of these promises. We're the original, and we've got all this stuff. And now they got a website. They're promoting applications for certificate of fellowship. Send us your tithe. We've got the true association. Well, this address is basically a private home that him and his wife purchased. We're going to report on them shortly. So please subscribe to this channel. You'll get the bell icon, the update. We're going to go into the details of who is this guy, where does he come from, because most people have no idea. So this is a splinter off of Don Adair. Most people don't know that Samuel Gonzalez came in under Salem about around the year 2002. He was living in Florida at the time, and his sister wanted him in, who was part of Salem. So he's really a splinter off of Salem, although he's probably not going to admit it. Now, so that's the Salem offshoot, if you will, or splinter factions. Mountaindale, so I show the arrow going from New Salem to Mountaindale. That's the group of about 50 brethren up in New York that merged with Yucaipa in 86 and formed Mountaindale. Well, sure enough, as soon as Mountaindale reorganized, the devil doesn't stand idly by. There's got to be another usurper. Oh, I missed this. After Yucaipa, there was a split. You see this pattern repeated over and over. And Wanda Bloom, Don Adair's second wife, and Erwin Reichman were trying to remodel the literature at Yucaipa, and there was opposition to it. And so they split off and broke in 1983 and formed International GADSDA. So you see all the confusion, all these different GADSDAs. But that association is located in California, Northern California, and that still exists even though Wanda Bloom has died recently. this past year. So the question is that I think there's a man named Anthony Dugo who's continuing on this group. I haven't verified that. Now we get to Mountaindale, of course. There's a splinter off that. The key date here is what I call New Waco and Norman Archer. Norman Archer wanted a position, and he schemed this rebellion claiming, we got to go back to Waco based on a few statements from the old codes that they've discovered that came from Sister Bonnie Smith. So that whole illegal, unauthorized reorganization back in Waco was done by Norman Archer, and now that's another Mount Carmel Center GADSDA. And after them have been various splinters. A group in Florida, Burke McLean, Bobby Dice, broke from, they saw the corruption in Waco, but so they got a group there in Florida. Eric Bell in Texas thinks that the headquarters still got to be in Texas, but he doesn't agree with Archer, so there's a splinter. And then one of the more notorious ones, starting around the year 2007, was Lennox Sam and his wave sheaf movement that merged or evolved into the 11th Hour Church. Total counterfeit. So these are all splinters off of this counterfeit, unauthorized New Waco branch that started with Norman Archer and crew. Some other splinters off of the Mountaindale line, Layman's Movement, Ariel Dakatanan. This was largely based out of the Philippines. He published a whole line of counterfeit literature, had a bunch of young people with him. Now, he has died recently as well, I think last year, 2022. So what's happened to this movement is not clear at this point. And then we get down to some important developments. 2005 Mountaindale split. I was there in person, and they split between what I call the ones that remained behind Old Mountaindale and then a group that broke away and tried to reorganize in Middle Tennessee. 2005. Now, 2006, UPA 7 arose because this group in Middle Tennessee were more worried about tithes and trying to recreate an executive council. So they were trying to cloak themselves with the corrupted Florence Houteff Association structure and less worried about the literature. That movement is kind of dissolved, but from Mountaindale, okay, we got what I call Old Mountaindale. They still cling on to the Florence Houteff leadership model, and they also cling on to the unauthorized new codes. And then recently, about a year ago, there's a group within there that began to question it, and then they had a split in 2022, and this is the origin of the pre-11th hour ministry. And this is started by Peralta, Rene Reyes, Terry Harrison. The latter two are former ministers under Mountaindale. Mountaindale is mandating you have to teach according to the new codes, and so these two brothers says, no, we can't do that. So they broke away, reorganized this ministry. It's not clear. They're very clever in their semantics, their terminology. They don't call themselves an executive council or GADSDA. They claim, we're waiting for Mountaindale to come around. They never will. But so I put a dashed red line around there because they came up with, we now have a publishing, a board of directors with 7 people. Who appointed them? I guess they appointed themselves. So their leadership structure is kind of vague. It's kind of like voting and nominating. They must have done it somehow. So I put the dash red. It's not entirely clear what their organizational structure will be. Same with Samuel Gonzalez and GADSDA 22. He hasn't revealed all that. So friends, that's the breakdown. The key is stick with the original publications. Universal Publishing, that's the foundation, and that can be spread around the world. Now we got a key over here just to highlight. The green is the original Shepherd's Rod literature. Who kept that alive? The various branch splinters in pink, a mixture of sin and mixture of truth and error. Purple, the Bashan splinters, and then the yellow is the various splinters of people that are in the Carmel pasture. So friends, this is the most historically accurate breakdown showing the true lineage of UPA, the God's Storehouse that kept alive the original Rod literature, uncontaminated with new codes or anything else, and also stripped now free of the Florence Houteff corrupted leadership model. So take some time, print this out, study it, examine it, ask us questions. Would you like documentation for every step of this? We have a whole archive of documentation for every step of this, and identifying these movements by what they published and what they teached and who was behind it. We have all of that information. If you're interested, please contact us. Email at the end of this presentation. We'll supply you everything that we use to generate this graphic. I hope it was helpful for you to understand who we are and where we come from. So this concludes this presentation. If you have any comments, questions, or feel free to contact us anytime. Here's our website. Here's our email, phone number. You can text, call, or connect with us on this 860 number through WhatsApp. We have brethren throughout the world connected through that. Or better yet, visit our website, yparish.org. We have a lot of documentation on this. Leave a comment on our blog post of the study. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, Universal Publishing. Make a comment. And if you have any questions, we'll help you out to clarify who it is that God is leading today. So may God bless your search for truth as for hidden treasure, and to cease from all men whose breath is in his nostrils. We thank you, and Godspeed.